The morale phase is changing. It no longer exists. Okay, I won't just end the video there. So, morale. In earlier editions of 40k, at the end of a phase, you would roll 2d6, and if that was higher than the leadership characteristic of your unit, you would fail your morale and have to fall back towards your table edge. This could be caused from casualties in shooting phase, movement phase, psychic phase, that's another phase that's not going to exist, or if it was in the combat phase, you would have to try and escape the enemy trying to stab you to death. This could often lead to you being completely wiped out. In 8th edition, it was rather different. You would roll 1 dice, add the number of casualties that the unit had suffered, and if those numbers combined was higher than your leadership value, you would remove a model for every point that total exceeded your leadership value. The problem with that was that you could see from the number of casualties inflicted whether an enemy unit would flee or not, and decide just not to continue shooting at them or charging them, because you knew that give it another phase, they're not going to be there anymore. It made morale and leadership something that's very intangible in real life, a sudden very hard characteristic, and that wasn't particularly interesting. So in 9th edition, we had morale, but it was another very badly worded mechanic. You would roll 1 dice, add the number of casualties, and if that exceeded your leadership value, you would fail the test. Now, 1 model would automatically flee. For every other model in the unit, you would roll a dice. If the dice was a 1, then another model would flee. However, if the unit was under half strength, then it would be another -1, so they would run on a 1 or a 2. And then there were further units that changed this, or just this part, or just the morale. Little bit difficult. 10th edition again, much easier. What does it do now? It is called Battle Shock, an Age of Sigmar term. At the start of your turn, in the command phase, you take a Battle Shock test for each of your units on the battlefield that are under half strength. So unit 5, if 3 of them dead, the remaining 2, they would take the test. You roll 2 dice, and if the result is greater than or equal to your leadership, the test is passed. Otherwise, you're going to take some penalties. You can't control objectives, and you can't have stratagems used on that unit. You might want some tokens to put next to these units to remember who failed, like how Bolt Action has pinning tokens. This change brings morale a bit more like the battles of the last century. You get pinned down, you hide in your foxhole, rather than sprinting away across a field while under fire. It doesn't make your shooting or combat worse. You can still kill things and use guns and run at the enemy and stab them with a knife. You're just going to be screaming while you do it. Now, you may notice that this doesn't stop you from doing actions. I believe this is because actions won't exist in 10th edition. It was a mechanic that meant a unit could move on objective and then do an action instead of shooting or charging. This encouraged an army composition with multiple small support units, MSU, whose job it was to walk around sticking flags in rocks and searching for stuff in the dirt while the battle went on around them. More on MSU in a minute. But actions weren't super involved. Just claiming an objective should be enough to control it. That's the whole reason we have these objective control categories now, and previously had the objective secured rule. There are some interesting points you should note about the changes in morale that affect the entire game. You can fail morale multiple times in a game. It doesn't look to be fail it once and that's it forever. It'll be on a turn-by-turn basis. So turn 2, one of my units fails morale. Next turn, that unit gets to roll again, and may pass or may fail once more. It is done in your own command phase, and the effects last until your next command phase. For the first time in all of the editions of 40k, you now want to roll high for your morale test. This is something keeping it consistent with all other rules in the game, where a 1 is bad and a 6 is good. Another improvement to make the game much easier is you no longer have to track which units took casualties in which turn, because of course having 3 people killed at once from a cannon is scary, but having your people picked off one by one over the battle, no sweat apparently. Well, now in 10th edition you can look around and see that it's just me and Bill and think, yeah, trying to hold on to Blood Corpse Hill might not be the best thing for me right now. Another point to note when looking at this is that Desperate Escape looks like a hazardous choice and is not a stratagem. I don't think I ever used its equivalent in 9th edition called Desperate Breakout, where you could move through enemy units but at a risk. It will be hazardous, which is a new universal special rule, which means that you take mortal wounds or remove the model if you roll a 1. This is going off Already shown off profiles like the Librarian and the Weird Boy and how psychic powers work where they may be hazardous. And I've had to use their profiles to look at psychic things because they are not yet showing off Bimbly Brian name pending. 9th edition rewarded the use of multiple small units to do actions, but now large units are rewarded for buffs from characters, and it will take longer for them to suffer morale. It also looks way cooler on the battlefield to have large squads and hordes. Now what about the fear-causing units? This is where you have sub-factions like the Night Lords and entire armies like the Dark Eldar that rely on being scary as part of their tactics to murder everyone. They may be sad that morale is no longer going to be removing enemy units, but morale-affecting tactics to make the enemy run away were either mildly effective or entirely useless due to rules like Synapse, or being a Sacred Rose sub-faction, best battle sister faction, or the Space Marine rules No Fear, or having a commissar nearby, or having a high leadership army. Or more often, with multiple small units, the enemy was already dead after you hit them. While sub-factions are going away and Night Lords may not get anything in particular, the Dark Eldar, drukhari, however you want to call them, could have a detachment stratagem to make leadership harder for the enemy and make more enemy units less effective. If the enemy can't hold an objective, they can't win the game. Individually for the Night Lords, Raptors may still make the enemy in engagement range -1 leadership, but Night Lord tactics on a whole would have to rely on taking these units, rather than having a sub-faction bonus because sub-factions are not going to exist, with their own unique rules. We have been seeing changes to vehicles, as they are not only getting tougher, but transports are making a firm comeback. You can now move a vehicle, have the unit inside get out, and that unit can still shoot, though they cannot charge. So we're going to see gunning units being transported far ahead of the front lines, jumping out and making a whole mess of the enemy, much like they did in 6th edition, where I used this tactic very effectively with a bunch of Chosen with flamers, plasma guns, melter guns, and so on. Now, for morale, lone operative characters, I've mentioned them before in a character video, and vehicles as well, have learned to be afraid when they're under half wounds. Maybe if you have a hole in you, then you are less inclined to fight, or to stay parked on an objective in front of a grinning woman with a melter gun. That was a quick look into the implications of the changes to morale. I recommend this video next on another game-changing rule. Until I speak to you again, have a great day of 40k, my darlings and viewers.